power on.
The following is a presentation of the Sovryn Tech Podcast Feed.
Ooh, you have got the best in the world, baby. And this is one I've wanted to do for months now. Very excited to do, to do this episode. And really putting this under the gaming grid, because, well, we're going to talk about a device that, frankly, over the past 10 years, I've shit on a lot. And I'm not going to say that I was wrong in shitting on it, because at the time, during its lifespan, it deserved any derision that I gave it. And not that I gave it like harsh derision or anything. I mean, I think I said some complimentary things about it, but we'll get into it. But bottom line is that now that this device is out of its official lifespan, now I consider it perhaps the greatest console on the planet. But that's only true now. But what are we talking about? Well, I'm sure you already saw it in the podcast title. We are talking about the PlayStation Vita. The PlayStation Vita was, this is technically part of the 8th generation of consoles. And, there were a lot of, well, its main competitor, you could say, was the Nintendo 3DS. Of course, it was the successor to the successful PlayStation Portable, or at least I think the PlayStation Portable was successful. But when this was officially released in Japan, it came out in December of 2011. So we're actually celebrating almost 10 years to the day, because this came out December 17th, 2011. So we're looking at 10 years, on the Vita itself as hardware goes. Of course, the rest of the world would end up seeing it in February of 2012. At the time, even though this is like part of the 8th generation, at the time, it was getting released when the Wii was still the big deal. Technically the Wii U came out in 2012. So I guess the Wii U would be there, partly as competition. And then you would have, the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3 would be the headliners for Microsoft and Sony, respectively. But the Vita, it seems pretty clear Sony had in mind for the Vita to play in conjunction with the PlayStation 4, which wouldn't come out for a year or two after the Vita had already hit store shelves. It's interesting. I'm not going to go any distance with this, and really, Microsoft doesn't need to make a portable console at all. It is interesting, that Microsoft never really went that distance. They never got into that market. I think a lot of people feel that Sony overall was foolhardy for trying to take on Nintendo in the portable gaming market, because certainly plenty tried, and outside of the WonderSwan or, the Turbo Express didn't do anything. The Atari Lynx didn't really do anything in comparison. The Game Gear is probably the main competitor that anybody would even remember, that took on Nintendo's dominance in portable gaming. You had the Nokia N-Gage, right, which is somewhat, laughable. But really, Microsoft never has to do that because of Game Pass and, or what they used to call xCloud, both of those in conjunction, you can play, the Xbox library on any screen, right? As long as you have a good enough internet connection now. And of course, now we have rumblings that Sony is looking at doing the same thing, where they want to have a cloud gaming service that gives you access to a lot of PlayStation's history. Will that include Vita games? Maybe. Partly Vita games relied upon the Vita's touchscreen, so that becomes a bit of a concern as to what hardware could actually play it. And that touchscreen factoid will play into, I think, the importance of owning an actual Vita. But anyway, let's talk about the Vita some more. So the Vita itself, there were two major models. There's what gets called the PS1000 and then the PS2000 version, or the 2000 is also called the Slim model of the PlayStation Vita. Again, originally came out in 2011 in Japan, but worldwide was discontinued on March 1st, 2019. So it got in a fairly good console life cycle, of almost 7 to 8 years, which that's the average life cycle of console generations. Granted, that's changing now, but that used to be the norm. So I wouldn't say that they canceled it as a failure, but they never, it seemed like Sony was never interested in making a successor to the PlayStation Vita. So that lends to the credence that, it wasn't a successful device, and it was an expensive device to make. One of the major reasons I think that they did a revision for the from the PS1000 to the PS2000, you can see in what is really the major difference between the two. Actually, there are two major differences between them. With the PS1000, you have a very premium, super premium, like metallic/plastic feel to the device. It is a luxury device in a very real way. And it has an OLED screen, which in 2011, 2012, not common. That was latest tech. Okay. So, you could see where they were trying to, they're going with this premium feel to try and best Nintendo in the handheld market. Now, that premium feel comes at a cost. An OLED screen in 2012, not an inexpensive affair. And I think that's why in fairly short order, in just a matter of, a couple of years, they end up releasing the PS2000, which dumps the OLED screen and is entirely plastic. It really does lose that premium or that luxury feel. I think it still has a perfectly fine premium feel, but it does lose that luxury feel. The screen difference, yes, you can see it, but we will talk about that more, when we get into it. Myself, I own a PS2000. I own a Slim model, and I was very proactive in wanting the Slim model. And, I don't miss any advantage that the PS1000 had. The biggest problem I actually have with the PS1000 is the proprietary cable for charging. And I don't dig that at all. Now, it's a shame. I wish if the PS2000, if the Vita 2000, the Vita Slim, if that had, so it has a micro USB, which is still, popular. It's certainly not proprietary. If it had a USB-C port on it, and in fact, I know there are people out there who modify, they break out the soldering pen, the whole thing. They modify their PS Vitas to have USB-C ports on them. Believe me, there's times where I'm tempted to do that. In fact, at some point, I'm probably going to have to do a rebuild on my Vita. And when I do that rebuild, I might go all the way and put a USB-C port on it, because really it's the last device I have, minus say maybe a pair of classic Bluetooth headphones, that uses a micro USB. Now, it's easy enough. I have a USB-C to micro USB adapter that I have on like my keychain. I have tons of them, and they're inexpensive and they work beautifully. So it's not, it's not like you really have to have that USB-C, but for me, admittedly, it'd be nice. And I know there are other Sovryn Tech listeners out there who love to have, that one charger to rule them all. Now, as far as power, as in like horsepower of the device itself, the Vita is pretty fucking powerful for what it is, for a handheld device. Again, your average smartphone today, they're huge, right? They're almost like 7-inch devices now. This isn't that much bigger than your average smartphone today. That gets into that near 7-inch range, even if they're like taller. It has a 5-inch screen. Okay. And it is a touch screen, has a touch panel on the back. It has, we'll get into, there's issues with buttons on this. Not to say that there's issues with the buttons that are on it. It's just there's some that are missing that can make it less effective at certain things. But we'll talk about that. Has stereo speakers that are forward-facing, which I love. A far better design than the later refresh of the Nintendo 2DS XL. And, that's important to keep in mind that, again, really the main competitor here between, for the Vita was the 3DS family. And we're going to talk about that more in a minute. But you have twin analog sticks that are tiny but feel really good. In fact, you can even get, and maybe we'll talk about this more when we get into accessories for the device, some of which I think are necessary. You can get these like little rubber grips that are common for any video game console that has an analog stick that gives the stick a little more grippy feel and a little more, just a better feel overall. But you have your more or less standard PlayStation controller setup. You have a D-pad that feels really, really slick. You have a PlayStation button that acts like a home button. You have select and start. You have, the square, triangle, circle, X buttons as you know them. You have an L and an R shoulder button, but you do not have an L2 and R2, nor do you have an L3 or R3. We'll talk about that. You have volume buttons that are not a rocker, like they're actually two separate buttons. I actually appreciate that. And of course, a power button, headphone jack, which is nice. You have a slot for games themselves when you buy physical copies of games that you can put in, and you have a slot for Sony's proprietary, little Magic Gate flashcards, and which functioned as memory cards essentially. These are. A lot of people say that was the real killer for the Vita, was because Sony wasn't using micro SD cards, for memory storage and for any kind of storage, because you can also buy games digitally. You don't have to do physically. But to expand the storage on the Vita, you essentially had to buy Sony's proprietary cards, proprietary memory cards. And those were wildly expensive throughout the history of the Vita. I mean, we're talking, anywhere from $80 to hundreds of dollars. I mean, it was preposterous what you had to pay for that. And that got in the way of what should have been the main driver of sales for the device, which would have been, the PlayStation Store. So that's worth mentioning as well. But, you're going to say, well, shit, if I need to get one of these, do I have to buy? I mean, do they even make those cards anymore? How long are they going to last? We are going to talk about that. Don't worry. Because this is a device, when done right, that can really stand the test of time, though you may want to buy two. Anyway, it has cameras, has a front-facing camera. I mean, these are very low-res cameras, nothing super impressive. It does have a rear-facing camera as well, that allows for, there's some games that take advantage of that, but they are what they are. And that's really it for buttons, other than on the back is not really a touch screen, but a touch pad. That has different touch sectors that can do differing things, and we will talk about that later as well. And of course, the front, whether it's the 1000, the PS 1000 version and it's the OLED screen, or if it's the slim version and it's the LCD screen, but you do have a very well functioning, very tough touch screen for the main display of the device that works really, really well. And plenty of games do take advantage of it, even though the touch functionality does feel like an afterthought. More games will take advantage of the touch screen on the actual display as compared to the touch pad on the back, which seems like a bit of a gimmick. But we'll actually be glad that it's there when we talk about it. So not much different, like the setup overall is very much like the PlayStation Portable, which again was very successful. And as far as games natively available, you had, with the PlayStation Store, you had the capability to buy, PlayStation Portable games and play them on the Vita. It can play them natively, okay? And you had also the ability to buy PS1 classics. So you could play PlayStation 1 games, some PlayStation 1 games directly, from the store, and they play beautifully on this. And again, it's a fairly powerful device. It has a quad-core ARM Cortex A9, for the CPU, and then it has a quad-core GPU as well. So there's plenty of horsepower here to handle, PlayStation 1 games, and to handle the PlayStation Portable games, of course, and really to do a whole lot more. And that's what we're going to be talking about here in a minute. But let's take a moment to talk about the games. So, like some of the marketing and major push around the Vita was that it was supposed to be bringing the console level experience into your hand. In many ways, I feel like, and it's not until I've really messed with one that I've come to this conclusion. In many ways, Sony, like they did the Switch, the Nintendo Switch, like they did that design before Nintendo really did. In fact, ultimately, I feel like you could get away with, if you had a Nintendo Switch and a PlayStation Vita, you have an unmatched, you have access to such an amazing game library between those two. But that said, while that's the marketing, and eventually the Switch would actually become that, and in comparison perhaps to the PlayStation 3 and certainly besting the PlayStation 2, the Vita was delivering on that promise of being, a TV console essentially in your hands. And I mean, like this idea would go so far as to where they would do PlayStation TV, which was essentially a TV version, a version of the Vita that connected directly to your TV and, but didn't work on its own. Of course, not every game that you could play on the Vita could be played with PlayStation TV, partly because of touchscreen controls or touchpad controls. Touch controls, we'll just say that. But, that's how far Sony was going with this. But again, overall, it seems that the Vita and regardless of how powerful it was and, effective perhaps that its design overall was, both the PlayStation TV and the Vita itself, did not do well. Now, why do I think that is? Ultimately, I think it comes down to the games. There are very few killer apps, on the Vita. There are very few games that you can only play on the Vita. And when you're talking about an 8-year life cycle, you can't just have 10 games that are worth playing on it. You've got to have a lot of games. And I think the 3DS, which I've often said during the 8th generation, I had said that this is the best console out there. It's better than the Wii U. It's better than, than the PlayStation 4. It's better than the Xbox One. Why? Not because it was, horsepower more powerful or that it was better because of, all that horsepower, because it somehow it had more horsepower. Of course it didn't. It was a portable system. It was better because the game library was just fucking insane. And I don't just mean the game library from Nintendo. I mean, the game library was nuts on the 3DS, to say nothing of the fact that you could play the 2D or you could play DS games on it as well throughout the entire life cycle of the 3DS. The 3DS was a bona fide, unquestionable success. Just, and it's not even the 3D that mattered, right? But just the system overall was just a wild success. And the Vita was not. And I don't mean to insult it. We'll get into that, okay? But I think that all comes down to there are great games. There are great games that largely are only playable on the Vita. So there are great games for it, but there just aren't enough to justify its existence. And so come 2019, the Vita officially meets its end, and there's no successor to it, in mind. And I mean, I'll say it that that's, in some ways it's a shame, but there's no way that Sony could compete with the Switch. They still can't compete with the Switch, from Nintendo. So I mean, just, portable gaming is completely, Nintendo has just totally dominated it now. It's over. Right. I think it's so cute that you have, I don't know, whatever, ARM has, Qualcomm has this reference device for portable gaming system and all this other stuff. And it's just go ahead and your Android device can actually be, can be a pretty great gaming system if you connect, an 8BitDo, Pro 2 controller or whatever to it. And, you rock RetroArch or, whatever or even if it's just native Android games, whatever you put on there, that can be a really great, portable gaming system, certainly. But I mean, the Switch just has it. The market is cornered. And frankly, when you look at sales, the Switch was only bested in monthly console sales. What, almost 6 years into its life cycle? It took 6 years for Sony to finally beat it. And even then it was only 1 month, and then it went right back to the Switch dominating. And believe me, this is not just because of the chip shortage and supply chain problems and everything else in 2020, 2021. Maybe Microsoft and maybe Sony would have beaten, a couple months here and there, but the Switch would have just taken right back over. I can basically guarantee you that. So it's not really a surprise that Sony got out of the way, and said, okay, we're not in handheld gaming. We're not doing it, because the Switch is just, it's there and it is what it is. So, but I'm glad now that Sony is out of the way, because while, I can rip on the Vita for varying things, especially in comparison to its competitors like the 3DS, or what would have been the Switch, even technically for a couple of years there, because the Switch came out in 2017. And, we could even talk about the issue of where Sony, and there was a major backlash. There's a huge community that still plays the Vita. It's called, #Vita Island. And I think it's a beautiful thing. Like, I'm glad that there's such a large community and such a, excited, passionate community, pushing for the Vita, still being a thing. I mean, Vita games are still coming out. They're not there are no games that can come out via the PlayStation Store. And what I was going to bring up, in fact, was that, a couple of years ago, or it was about a little over a year ago, Sony came out and said, we're going to shut down the PS Vita store for the Vita and I think for the PlayStation 3. And people just flipped and said, the fuck you are? You're not going to shut down anything. And while they haven't shut it down yet, they are starting to shut down servers for certain games that have online functionality, like Soul Sacrifice Delta, Freedom Wars. All those you can play single player as well, by the way. But so, while they haven't shut them down yet, it's probably a matter of time before they do. But there are new games getting physical releases, because you can't, even though they haven't shut down the store, Sony is not allowing new games to get published to the PlayStation Store for the Vita. But you can buy physical copies of games. In fact, games that, kind of to prove my point that they were the Switch, before the Switch was even really a thing. A lot of them are games that are available on the Switch now that are new games for the Switch. So there are games to this day getting released physically for the PlayStation Vita. So arguably it's not a dead system. But, in Sony's eyes, it certainly is. But again, I'm glad that is true. I am glad that Sony has gotten out of the way, because now the Vita is living up to, or now the Vita is just, it's a whole other beast. It's not living up to anything. It's just a whole other fucking beast. And ultimately, I think you could easily argue it's the greatest console of all time. Now, again, like I said earlier, nobody's mind has been changed here. During its official life cycle, it was not the greatest system ever made. It's only the greatest system ever made because Sony has forgotten about it, left it behind, but it's so fucking powerful, and there's such a passionate community behind it that the PlayStation Vita can now, once you install custom firmware on it, and, once you hack it, as it were, once you crack it, suddenly the problem of the Vita not having enough great games falls by the wayside. Now you have access to all the games. And really, that's not much of an exaggeration to say you have access to all the games. What I want to tell you about is what happens when you mod a PlayStation Vita. Because once you do, all bets are off. It almost becomes more, okay, it becomes more trying to figure out, what can't I do with this little handheld console? And really, the only thing I can compare it to is the original Xbox, which once you get, again, once Microsoft got out of the way on that, once you got into the custom firmware, once you got into the modding scene of the original Xbox, it's easy to argue that the original Xbox is the greatest console of all time, considering, what you can do with it. And the Vita is really the handheld. It's not a handheld Xbox, but it's the handheld version of that in the abstract, where it just seems like there's anything you can do. So if you're really into like not owning a TV for one, and you're really into, having a handheld gaming device, by the way, the battery life on this thing is fucking amazing. Wow, you get a good anywhere between 6 to 10 hours. And the standby time is what's really impressive. Like that battery just stays charged. Amazing on the PlayStation Vita. But yeah, especially if you're somebody who doesn't want to own like a big console, doesn't want to have the TV and everything, or, maybe you're like a digital nomad, you're doing some van life, all these things. This is the fucking system to own, baby. The Switch kind of bests it in that the Switch can be just as portable, but still allows for 2 to 4 players, as to where this is certainly a single player system, all the way. But as long as you don't mind that, you are in for a hell of a time. I am going to put a link in the show notes, a couple links in the show notes, to show you just how easy it is to, and it's from a guy, his YouTube channel is called Retro Game Core. I love this guy. This guy is awesome. And he's fairly new to retro gaming. He's not new to retro gaming. He's new to YouTube. But he's already gotten over 100,000 subscribers. I've been following him for quite a few months now. And he just does some of the most professional, just best, frankly, feel-good videos. I think the guy's out of Hawaii. He is in the U.S. Navy. But I got to tell you, in another life, I could really see calling him brother. Like he's written like paleo cookbooks and all this other stuff. Just a really impressive guy. And his videos, go and subscribe to him now and make sure you hit that bell for every time, because even if it's something you're never going to buy, because here's the thing. So he'll review a lot of mobile handhelds, like the ones that get made, like the AG 3350 and whatever, ones that are all like that are designed and use these differing boards that are designed, to be like emulation machines, right? Handheld emulation machines. He'll review all of those. But I can't see myself ever wanting to buy any of those, because the Vita can do everything that these things can do most of the time. He'll get into other things too, but I'll still watch every single video because the presentation is just so professional. And like I said, it's just really feel good stuff. That's one of the things I love about video games, is in comparison to all the other horseshit going on, like you can really get into video games and stay super positive, and the rest of the world doesn't come in. Gamergate being the exception, but there's whatever Activision's doing this week, and and all this jazz, and I know, and that shit's horrible, but especially when you stick to retro gaming, like you can just be happy, and I feel like he's one of those guys. He is one of those guys. He's just genuine. Tremendous class and style. And you can just be happy, it's a wonderful thing. So check out, it's Retro Game Core. In fact, when you watch his video, he opens up with music that'll sound very, very familiar to longtime Sovryn Tech listeners. Cause he uses, hexadecimal genome, which I've used on Sovryn Tech since 2012, since the very first episode. In fact, if you listen to the recent Sovryn Rewind, you'll have heard it. So we use, it's from BitShifter, who I knew years past. It's just funny that the first time I heard him, I'm like, hey, wait a minute, because outside of BitShifter, I think that music's most attached with Sovryn Tech, but I love that he uses it as his theme, and he's really owned it. This guy's just doing some of the best fucking work on the internet, bar none. So anyway, he has a great guide that he came out with in August, and he shows you just how quickly, and it's a matter of minutes, and he does a great job of explaining everything of how you can crack mod a PlayStation Vita. And it is a really simple process now, especially if you have a Windows computer and you're going to want one. I'm not going to re-narrate the process because why would I think I'm going to best perfection in what Retro Game Core put out there? But here's the deal. As far as I know, some people actually, I talked about this ahead of time with some people in the Discord server, and there was a question of, should I get a PS 1000 or should I get the slim version? Should I get the PS 2000? I like the 2000 again a lot better. It used to be, I don't know that there's the same issue now where it's easier to mod the 2000 as compared to the 1000. That used to be true. But I feel like the 2000 is a lot tougher. The OLED screen doesn't mean that much to me. There's just overall, I like the 2000 better. But you can look, Retro Game Core actually has videos on the differences between the two, and you can decide for yourself on what you think. But I go with the 2000, and in fact, the 2000 is also cheaper. Here's a couple deals. You can get a Vita 2000 for, anywhere between $150 to $600 right now. $150 will get you a used one, and it'll be used one out of Japan. We'll talk about that. $600, and in that range, $300 to $600 could get you a new one in box. So, if you want to go, do I think it's worth $300 to $600? Actually, I absolutely fucking do think it's worth that. So if you really want to get a new one, go for it. It's worth that money. Is it worth $150? Easy. Easy. Again, once modded, it's the greatest system on the planet. The only thing that matches it, again, would be an original Xbox, and matching it in form factor, maybe a Nintendo Switch, which is going to cost you much more than $150. You also need to get what's called SD to Vita, and it's SD, the number 2 Vita. SD to Vita, and again, this is all of this are in links in the show notes. You can find, where to get this stuff. This is a little card that, is in the shape of a Vita cartridge that lets you put a micro SD card in it, and you can get a 256 gig micro SD card. I actually recommend going for a 512. Like, go all the way, because once you realize how much you can play on this thing, you're going to want all of the storage you can fucking get. Okay. Once you put in that SD to Vita micro SD card, adapter with the micro SD card in it, you're never going to take it out. Okay. Because the way you mod the system and set it up, it runs off of the micro SD card. So you can't really do the Vita, like the entire system is moved over to this micro SD card. So keep that in mind that, when you do this with a Vita, it's going to be a pain in the ass to go back to playing physical copies of these games, but then you don't need to. We'll talk about that. So you're going to need that. That's kind of like the key thing, to make this all work is that SD to Vita adapter. But the adapter costs $10. And then the micro SD card, depends on what size you get. You're looking at anywhere between 20 to 70, I suppose. So then you'll go through the process of modding it, via software. Again, you are going to want a Windows computer for a couple things. We'll talk about that. But the video the Retro Game Core does is 15 minutes long, and it really doesn't take you any longer than that. I mean, it's amazing how fast you get this thing modded. Now, once it's modded, you then have the option of a few things. One, you can now play PlayStation Vita games. Again, you're going to install them onto the device via you'll download it from your computer. You can actually download it with the Vita itself, but it's very slow. I recommend downloading via the computer, and you can just put Vita games on there, and boom, and you're playing Vita games. So I'll list off for you quick here what Vita games I have installed on my Vita, and these are essentially the only ones I'm would imagine taking the time to play in any form or fashion. So I'll list these off here. Could I do a top 8 of Vita games? I think that could be a separate episode, but that's also one where, I need to play some of these games to be able to really say that. So I'm not prepared to do a top 8. But there's certainly some games I've played that I've really dug. So there's, what is easily the best game on the system, and in my opinion, and it's essentially the reason I went with a Vita, even though what really finally got me sold on getting a Vita was when I realized how much it could do, but for a long time, cause I'm just, I mean, you never say never, but I'm not going to buy a PlayStation 3. I'm not going to buy a PlayStation 4. I'm sure as fuck not going to buy a PlayStation 5. Like I have no interest in that. I already have consoles, and I have plenty of consoles with plenty of games that I still have yet to play. Like, for the rest of my, what some would call a natural life, though, the dark side gives you the ability to, some people consider unnatural, but anyway, excuse me. In my natural lifetime, like what I have right now as far as games, I'd be playing them all the way to the end. So I don't need to buy new consoles ever. But anyway, so some of these games that I'm about to list off are available like on the PlayStation 4, like Dragon's Crown, which again, I think is the best game for the system and the reason that I got it. That is available on the PlayStation 4. I don't recall if it got released elsewhere. But I'm just fine and dandy because most of the enhancements, other than maybe some like upscaling with graphics, the enhancements made for like the PS4 version were, downstreamed to the PS Vita version with like the voice acting and everything else. It's kind of like it's a mix between Streets of Rage and Skyrim. Like that's how I could describe the game to you. And it is an absolute work of art. Like it is a gorgeous game. It looks like you're playing a painting. Of course, we can think of some Zelda games like that, right? But anyway, but it looks like you're playing a painting. It is a masterpiece of a game and frankly, I think it's worth the Vita alone. But there's more here. So again, we're only talking about Vita games. So Dragon's Crown, Dead or Alive 5 Plus. That's a great fighting game, of course. Dead or Alive Extreme 3 Venus. I have Dynasty Warriors 8 Extreme Legends Collector's Edition. Metal Gear Solid HD. Of course, which that has actually 2 games, right? That has Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3. Or is that 4? Well, anyway. Wipeout 2048. Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3. Mortal Kombat, which is technically Mortal Kombat 9. TXK, which is the latest version of Tempest. Beautiful game. Killzone Mercenary, Operation Babel, Galgun Double Peace, Darius Burst CS, Gravity Rush, which Gravity Rush I would put in the top 3 games on the system right now. Injustice, which of course is the Mortal Kombat versus DC, the God of War Collection, Soldner X2, Norn 9, Geometry Wars Dimensions, Persona 4 Golden, Tearaway, Soul Sacrifice Delta, PlayStation All-Stars, Dead Nation, New Little King's Story, which Little King's Story, if you never played that on the Wii, boy, did you miss out. New Little King's Story, a lot of fun. Odin Sphere Luftrasser, I don't think I said that right. But anyway, Ridge Racer, which is dynamite on the Vita. The newer, I mean, they didn't give it like a number or anything, but it's a newer version of Ridge Racer, and it's amazing. Ninja Gaiden's Sigma 2 Plus, Resogun 2064, Ninja Gaiden Sigma Plus, Blaze Blue Extend, Blaze Blue EX, Horizon Chase. Aha. And yes, it's Turbo. Xenocrisis. Yeah, how's he playing these? We'll talk about it. Because these were not like, in the PlayStation Store. Unmetal Sense. That's the Cyberpunk Ghost Story, right? Cursed Castilla. Synergia, Skull Pirates, Velocity Ultra, and Velocity 2X. Velocity 2X you can get on most consoles, probably in the top 100 games in history. So, I put it here. Virtua Tennis 4, Skullgirls Second Encore, Grim Fandango Remastered, Atari Flashback Classics, Full Throttle. Yeah, baby. Every system gets Grim Fandango, which is a classic point and click from LucasArts back in the 90s. But not every system gets Full Throttle. The Vita did, and it's brilliant when they did the remaster. that another one where, boy, what a great, it's great to have the Vita. And then the Bard's Tale remastered, Spy Hunter, and Jet Set Radio. Of course, also one of the greatest games ever made anywhere. So those are the Vita games that I have on here, and I mean, maybe there's a couple more out there that I would put on there. But I don't really feel I need them. And in fact, I don't, other than like Dragon's Crown and a couple other games, I really don't spend a whole lot of time playing Vita games on my Vita. Why? Because I can play fucking everything else. Because at the end of the day, what I really think the Vita as, I think of the Vita as the best PlayStation 1 ever released. That's what I really think of the Vita. Because so now you can put on other software. Okay. So as soon as you mod it, you can start popping on your Vita games, right? But you can put on other software, and, to talk about the software, there's really, again, very little, and I don't just mean in what consoles it can emulate and play, but there's actually very little the Vita can't do. It's very much a mini computer, and Sony had the dream for a very long time for their PlayStation consoles to be, mini PCs. Like, you used to be able to put Linux on the PlayStation 3. Used to. Sony killed that because people were pirating games, but, via that functionality. But that's a whole other, George Hotz, that's a whole other story. Anyway, you can start putting on other software and emulators onto the Vita once you have it modded. One of those, and perhaps the most important, is what's called Adrenaline. Now, Adrenaline gives you access to the Vita's native ability to play PlayStation Portable games. Okay, the previous, the predecessor to the Vita, as well as PlayStation 1 games. Now, the PlayStation 1 games, and there's a couple ways that you can get your hands on these things, as well as the Vita games. There is a specific browser made for Windows, okay, called No PlayStation, as in you're not going to pay for it. It's called No PlayStation, and that gives you access to hundreds of Vita games, PlayStation Portable games, as well as PlayStation 1 games. To play PlayStation 1 games on the Vita or on the PlayStation Portable, if you happen to have one of those cracked or modded, you have what is it, like the eBoot format? It's a very specific format. It's not just, you can't just copy and paste an ISO. You can't just copy paste a disk image onto the device and then it works. But all this gets done in Adrenaline, and you can play, as long as you have it in an eBoot format, you can play any PlayStation 1 game on it and it works brilliantly. Okay. The PlayStation Store itself, built into the system, had some PlayStation 1 classics, but really you can play any one that you want. Even, modded versions or, like patched versions of PlayStation games. Like you could play Police Knots, right? Which never got a Western release, but it has a very famous English patched version. So, you can do all of that. I was bringing up about the computer, the mini computer thing. I mean, this has a web browser, an email client, a chat client. It has all this shit built into it. Some of which won't work without PlayStation servers or, without Sony servers. Others of which work right off the device, and work exceptionally well. There's even, when you go to the PlayStation Store, which again is still functioning, you can get apps. Like there are apps, and we're going to go a little further than that, but there are also other apps that allow for differing functionality, like watching movies and things like this, but we'll talk about that. But with Adrenaline installed, then you get access to, playing whatever PlayStation Portable game you want to play and whatever PS1 game that you want to play. Now, the challenge that you're going to run into, not with PlayStation Portable, because they had the same button layout as the Vita does now. The challenge is with some PlayStation 1 games, we mentioned this briefly earlier, you need the L2 and R2 buttons. L3 and R3 don't really matter. You do have the dual analog sticks, so that's fine. But you do need, L2 and R2, like say with Colony Wars, which, that whole trilogy those are some of the best games ever made for the PlayStation 1. Actually, some of the best games ever made. So how do you solve this? Well, there's two ways that you can solve this. With Adrenaline, you can actually set up to where the rear touchpad on the Vita can act, the different touch zones can act as buttons, but it's a bit of a funny reach, even for me, and I have huge hands. It's a bit of a funny reach to do that, and the touchpad, like it can be iffy for it to work, okay? And also, one of the most common flaws that you get, especially if you're buying a Vita, like a used Vita, the touchpad on the back is often very scratched, and that can create varying issues. Okay. It's one of the easiest things to really be damaged, especially because it's kind of glossy, on the whole device itself. I want to take a second before I get into this with the L2 and R2 and how to fix it. I want to take a second that when you are buying these, the best way to get an inexpensive one is to buy a Japanese model. It'll take a little while, maybe a couple weeks longer, to get to you, okay? So be patient. But you'll get a cheaper price. It'll probably be in better shape. And not only that, this is where things are going to get a little odd, but it's not so much of an issue. In Japan, the X button and the circle button for any PlayStation console, their functionality is reversed. Okay, as to where circle is usually like the back button in America, and X is like enter or activate, it's reversed in Japan. And there's not a whole lot you can do about that. Now, when you're playing in a PlayStation, again, it's easy enough to set this up to where it's all in English and all of that, but you have to get used to the circle button function, circle and X being reversed. And there's a different feel. And it takes a little while to get used to that, especially if you've been playing PlayStation games for a huge chunk of your life, like myself. That said, one of the beauties here with, using Adrenaline on this is that you get the chance to play, like English patched games. And those games, while they are patched to where you can now read what's on the screen, their control scheme is still the Japanese control scheme. So it's really a good way of getting you used to using the circle button the way that it's used in Japan. But if you're playing an American version of a PlayStation game or of a Vita game or of a PlayStation Portable game or whatever, the X button will act like an American X button. Okay. Like the American setup. So you don't have to worry about that. It's just when you're navigating the menus that you're going to have to get used to, the circle button being your enter. That's the main difference here. So you have Adrenaline, you have access to all of these PlayStation 1 games. And I mean, I can't tell you how many I fucking have on here. There are so many. That's why I said get a 512 gig card, because you are in for the time of your life. But you got to get that L2 and R2 for some of the games, not all, but quite a few of them. And the best way to do that, I'll put a link in the show notes for it. It's not really a case, but it's kind of like an extended grip. Like you get those grip expanders for like the Nintendo Switch, right? It's like a grip that you can put on. And what it'll do is it'll put an L2 and an R2 button at the top, and it'll have a little pad that very firmly presses on the touchpad on the back. So even if your touchpad is really scratched up, the little pad that activates with the L2 and R2 trigger buttons that comes on with this, grip that you buy, it hits every time. I've never had an issue with it. You can even buy a grip, and if I think of it, I'll put both of them in there. You can even buy a grip that has like little toggle buttons that come over sort of like the top corners of the screen that will give you L3 and R3. So it'll even give you more buttons. And that's the one that I have. I feel like it kind of ruins the slimness of the device, but if you want ultimate functionality, I guess, or maximum functionality, it's not a bad idea to have those toggles. You can look into them. So it's easy to resolve this. You do not have to buy, there's a company called Hori, Hori, which buy plenty. I've bought plenty of their accessories in the past for like, Nintendo consoles and whatever else. They have a very famous grip that adds L2 and R2. That will cost you more than your Vita. That'll cost you anywhere from $150 to $200 to get their official version. There are versions of it, though, they're not made by Hori, and they're not as comfortable, admittedly, but there are versions on Amazon that you can get for $25. And I think for the amount of games that actually use it, I think spending the $25 is a fine and dandy thing. Because there's some game so the game I probably played the most on this so far, I was actually playing the PlayStation 1 version of Dune 2000, and I wiped the floor with it. It was awesome to play, with this, with the Vita, to have like a portable RTS. Now, I tried playing like Red Alert and Command and Conquer and everything. Those games don't play as well. Dune 2000, the PlayStation 1 version, was tailored for the PlayStation 1. Even though you could get the mouse for your PlayStation 1, right? If you really wanted to go that distance. So that worked really, really well for me, but it was also a game that, I was, playing for hours and hours and hours and hours on end. And if I had to use that grip, the L2 and R2 grip, that would have been pretty uncomfortable playing that amount of time. But fortunately, it's a game where L2 and R2 don't do anything. So, keep that in mind. But for most of the games that you want to play, I think the $25 grips are going to do you just fine on a cost-benefit analysis overall. Okay, so you can play PlayStation Vita games, you can play PlayStation Portable games, you can play PS1 games. What else can you do on this thing? Well, before we get into the emulators even, another piece of kit, another app you're going to want to install on this is what's called the Vita Homebrew Browser. And it is just that. It is a browser that works like the PlayStation Store. It's a digital eShop that will let you download ports and apps, games, ports of games, custom games, homebrew games, and as in ones that were never officially released, and apps for your system. So my homebrew, you can do folders on this, which is really nice. There are some apps that I grabbed, there's an app that allows you to read comic books, like CBR files, on the Vita. There are great there's already a built-in great movie player and a great music player. So if you wanted to put movies, and again, you only have a 720p screen here, so, don't get too crazy. What's the point of watching 4K video? There's an MP3 player built into it. There's a lot of that stuff. And, you can even use it as a camera if you really wanted. It's a shitty one, but you could even use it as that. But there's lots of little apps like that you can install and that you can get from the Homebrew browser. And there's others. There's ways of customizing and everything. There's a custom themes manager, which lets you change the theme of, the main menu of your Vita, which some of those can be really, really nice. So anyway, I bring all that up just to say, it is amazing what you can do with this thing. This really can be your media consumption device all the way. And, arguably, what keeps you from just doing this with a new and similarly priced, Kindle Fire, from Amazon? You can go pretty far with a Kindle Fire. You can install DuckStation, you can install RetroArch, you can install this other stuff and really turn a Kindle Fire into an awesome media consumption machine, right? Once you install F-Droid, and whatever else. But you're not going to be able to play the Vita games. So, and in fact, I should bring that up quick too. Because a lot of what I'm talking about here, you can just do on any Android device, not even a Kindle Fire. You can do it on almost any Android device. For me, the difference, and it kind of sucks because say you use DuckStation or even RetroArch, you can upscale the graphics on PlayStation 1 games, right? And they look amazing. When everything's smoothed out and upscaled, it's a really nice effect. You're not going to do that on the Vita. That's not going to happen. But that said, I don't, I like to be able to get away from my phone for one. Also, I don't want to drain my phone battery. I'd rather drain a separate device's battery to do all this. And more importantly, emulation for Vita games themselves is in very nascent to non-existent stages. So, you get to do everything that your Android device can do, but also play, AAA PlayStation Vita games. For me, that makes the Vita an easy choice. Even if I can't do some of the fancy upscaling on PlayStation games, and some other things. It's still, such a brilliant choice. Now, back to the Vita homebrew browser. There are tons of games that you cannot believe exist for the Vita. One of them, in fact, is Dune Legacy. I mentioned Dune 2000. Dune Legacy is an updated version of, it's a way of updating Dune 2, the original RTS Dune 2. So that's on here. Of course, you have to port all of your own files to it. That's also true for something that recently came out is you can play Vice City. You can play Grand Theft Auto Vice City on a Vita, the PlayStation 2 version, which is better than that horseshit that Rockstar just put out with the trilogy. But you have to copy over files from the PC version of Vice City, to make that happen. I hope that this becomes more popular with PlayStation 2 games, but I don't know how many that would be true for, because not a lot of PlayStation 2 games were ported to PC, which are the files that you actually need to make this work. But that said, there are PC games on here. As far as homebrew games, you have Shadow Warrior, you have Postal, the original Postal, you have Quake 2. In fact, the version of Quake on here is gorgeous. You also have, this is amazing to me, talk about gorgeous, Blake Stone. There were two Blake Stone games back in the day, Aliens of Gold and another one. These were early first-person shooters from the 90s, like Wolfenstein 3D style, okay? And yes, of course, you can put Doom on here, the original Doom. They have both of them available here via homebrew that play natively, beautifully, and they look amazing on this. I haven't seen, and I've played these games a lot. I even play them, via GOG. I haven't seen these games ever look this good. So there's a lot of classic shit to get your hands on here. AM2R, right? Another Metroid 2 remake that got banned by Nintendo. That's available here. And people, you can look in the Vita homebrew browser, and you'll see, December 6th, 2021. People are still, releasing new software, new games, new apps for the Vita via the homebrew browser. That's not the way to get Vita, or PSP or PlayStation 1 games. Like I said, you want to do that via the No Pay Station browser. Or, I guess you could go to, there are sites online. You could go to like CD Romance. You could go to some other ones where they have e-boots and all that jazz. That's an option certainly to go with as well. Because No Pay Station doesn't have everything. But anyway, other games that are ported here, did I already mention Shadow Warrior? I think I said that. But you have Sonic 1, Sonic 2, Sonic CD. Those are all there. Also, and this is even better, there are remakes, high-resolution remakes of Sonic 1 and Sonic 2 for the Sega Master System. Now, I've said in the past on Sovryn Tech that I think the best Sonic games are actually in 8-bit. The ones that they made, which are very different from the Genesis versions of those games. Sonic 1 and Sonic 2 for the Sega Master System, not the Genesis, are brilliant platformers on the order of any Mario game. And to have remakes, updated remakes, on the Vita, it's just icing on the fucking cake for this system. I absolutely love that. So there's a lot of other homebrew games that you might want to check out available in the homebrew browser. But that's something you're going to want to install pretty quickly. So all of that said, and I can't begin to, like I said, I couldn't begin to list all the PlayStation Portable and, PlayStation 1 games that I have installed on here. But suffice to say, you could play a huge chunk of the Metal Gear saga at its best on the Vita from, the PlayStation 1 all the way up to like the remakes, the HD remakes that got released for the Vita and the PlayStation Portable and so on. So you're really in for a great time with all of that. And of course, I play tons of Tomb Raider on this as well. Now let's get into emulators. You can install, and this is really the end all be all, but you can install RetroArch on the PlayStation Vita, and it works very well. It takes a long time to get set up just right, but it does work very well. So you are going to be able to play everything that is more or less available on RetroArch. So you're playing all the way up until like the, sixth generation of systems. Okay. You're going to play like you're playing Super Nintendo, Genesis, Sega Master System, all those things that they have cores, on RetroArch. Nintendo 64, that has a separate emulator that's called Daedalus X64. That works well most of the time, but I really don't like playing any Nintendo 64 games unless it's on the Nintendo 64 or it's a Nintendo-made remake on the 3DS. Otherwise, I don't really have any interest in it. Okay. But, you also have access to, the Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance library via RetroArch that works really well. There's a great standalone, like I said, with the N64, there's that has a standalone emulator. There's a great standalone emulator called MGBA, which has just been around forever, that is also ported to the Vita. I actually use that to play Game Boy games, and it does a brilliant job of that. So you have, all of these consoles, and there's a link in the show notes that'll list off all the consoles you have access to, as well as the cores you're going to want to use for the Vita itself. When you're putting on RetroArch, but you can play everything from the Vita, the PlayStation Portable, and the PlayStation 1, and then go from the PlayStation 1 back, go from that generation back, and you can basically play everything that had come out. And that's why I say this is just, and most of them work very well. There might be a couple Super Nintendo games that play a little funny, even in RetroArch. But in general, like 99% of what you want to play, you're going to be able to play. And that's what makes this now, again, once Sony got out of the way and once you mod it, that's what makes the Vita the greatest console, arguably the greatest console of all time. I never want to be without this thing. It's just so wonderful how much you can play. Like Ellen has been using, Mrs. Sovryn's been using the Switch a lot lately. And the funny thing is, I love this. I love the Switch. Absolutely love it. And I will be playing more of it. But I don't miss it for a second because I'll just sit right next to her and I've got the Vita in hand and, I'm playing all the greats. And I mean, again, once you mod it, like the level of customization that you can do to the system overall is just amazing. And I mean, there's such an active development community for this thing. I really I don't have a second one. At some point, I'll probably get one because again, I'm never going to want to be without this thing. It's easy enough to actually get full kit replacements, so as long as your screen and board and all that and battery are good, you could essentially for like $30, have a very new system, with these kits. So, again, buying a Japanese used one, I think is really the most cost-effective way to go. But like any of these other handheld emulation portables, the Vita just blows them away. Just blows them away. The part that bothers me is, that sadly, we're going to, I mean, there's only so many Vitas made. Fortunately, Sony made them exceptionally well. In fact, it's part of the reason that it failed is because they were so expensive to make. But that worries me, because I mean, and this is the importance of emulation, right? Is to preserve the ability to play these games. But the Vita, there's so much to it that you really need, to experience the Vita, you really need the Vita. And it's sad to consider that, there's going to be a point in the future, maybe 20 years from now, who knows, where there will no longer be Vitas. Hopefully, some company or 3D printing or whatever, or FPGAs will be at such a stage by that time that it's easy enough for us to really make our own Vitas, or emulation for Vita will, who knows? I hope that there's something, that the Vita will be preserved in some way. But for right now in 2021, this is the fucking system to own. Because it can play so many other systems, and it can play some things like the Vita itself, that no other system can. And really what it can play, and again, totally for free, right? Let's just be honest, totally for free, because you can download them all, whatever ROM for whatever system, you could play this system for the next 100 years without a repeat, with everything that it's capable of playing. It's nuts. And again, it's still active development. Like maybe the Nintendo 60, maybe Daedalus X64, maybe the Nintendo 64 emulator will get that much better. Again, I still feel like to play, Nintendo 64 games, you got to have that classic controller. There's a way to experience those games. And I need to do a Nintendo 64 episode as well, because that's another system that still gets a ton of active development. But the Vita, man, like if you said to me right now, Brian Sovryn, you're going to get stuck on an island, Vita Island. If you're going to get stuck on an island, what's the one system that you want to be stuck with, and you could have all the games that you want, what's the one system you'd want to be stuck on an island with? It'd be the Vita. And I wouldn't look back. I wouldn't even think twice. Like it's an instant answer. As long, if I can have it, loaded out the way that I have my Vita loaded out, easily, because I'll be just fine on that island, baby. At least as far as video games, I'll be having the time of my life. If I can charge it. I guess I'd have to have a solar panel as well. But, that makes it even better, right? Because you could easily charge this thing with a solar panel. So again, the PlayStation Vita, now that Sony has given up on it, now that you can crack, now that you can mod it without repercussion of any kind and no system updates to come, okay, which kept busting the mods over the year, or, during its lifespan. Now that it's modded and done, just nothing compares. This is the best. This is a hardcore gamer's gaming machine. You are in for such a treat with this thing when you get your hands on one. I'm sure you'll love it as much as I do. Now, before I wrap up, I do want to mention, so like I said, there are still games getting made for the Vita, but they are only being released physically. And that's usually being done through like PlayAsia or whatever company, handles that. If you look around, on that big bad internet, I'm pretty sure you can find ROMs of those physical only games, because again, the community around the system is just second to none. So if you're trying to find a copy of Unmetal, for Vita or Sense or, any of those, I'll just say you might be able to find them. And they're not like in the no pay station browser, by the way. That I want to be clear on that. And again, see what's happening is you're getting a lot of Kickstarters that are, that essentially funds the development of a lot of new games, like Unmetal and some others. And again, the Vita community is so passionate. It seems like they're making sure, because what'll happen is that when a game announces that, it's in development, or, that they're launching a Kickstarter or some kind of crowdfund, they'll say a stretch goal, like stretch goal 5. If we make $100,000 or whatever they make, we'll port it to the Vita. And then thankfully the companies actually do, or, the dev teams actually do it. And so, so they'll get released for the Vita. And it's like the Vita Island, hashtag Vita Island community is just so passionate. It seems like they make sure that if a game can be on the Vita, they're going to put the money down to make sure it can, or to make sure that it does get developed for it. And largely it's happened. Again, a lot of games that are new for the Switch are still coming out for the Vita in 2021. And I don't see that stopping. So there's still, even if you're the kind of person, but I want the excitement of new games coming out, you can still have that. Granted, it's a trickle, but you can still have that with the Vita. And I mean, it keeps me from getting certain games on the Switch because I can just pop them on the Vita. Just saying. So get your hands on this. Believe me, like the depths of what you can do with this thing are just unbelievable, and you are in for the time of your life. I did mention accessories earlier. I told you about the grippy thing. I told you about the thumbstick grips, the L2 and R2 grips. I'm going to put links in the show notes for those. For the 2000 model, there is a great Hori, if you don't care about the L2 and R2, Hori has a great flip case cover where it covers the screen and everything and makes it very pocketable, covers even the analog sticks. That's a nice addition to, a nice accessory to have for it. But, beyond that, there aren't a whole lot of things you need. I mean, it's cool because it has Bluetooth. The Vita, you can connect Bluetooth headphones, even though it does have a 1/8 jack on it. But you do have some options there as well as far as controllers go. So, there's not a whole lot of accessories to get for it. But I definitely recommend, either getting the grips, like I mentioned, or even getting that flip cover case and, protecting your system going forward. Because, again, you're going to love this thing. So that's it. I'm going to wrap up this Vita episode. I may do like a Vita top 8 as well as a PlayStation Portable top 8 in the future for the Gaming Grid in the Sovryn Tech feed. But for now, again, go grab your Vita and I will see all of you on the other side.